And so welcome everyone to the Hudson Valley Food Systems Coalition Food Access Interest Group. The Hudson Valley Food System Coalition is a transdisciplinary regional coalition whose mission is to realize a more equitable and regenerative Hudson Valley food system by connecting food processing, production, distribution, consumption, and waste management practices while encouraging the use of our region's food resources in order to ensure the long-term health and sustainability of our community. And you can learn more on that at hvfoodsystem.org, and I'll pop that link into the chat. My name is Sarah Salem. I use they, them pronouns, and I am the Director of Development and Strategic Initiatives at Duchess Outreach and a co-founder and co-facilitator of the Hudson Valley Food Systems Coalition. And I'm coming from the city of Poughkeepsie today, which is stolen Lenape territory. And we're very, very excited to be joined today by Nevin Cohen, who is an associate professor at the City University of New York, CUNY Graduate School of Public Health and Health Policy, and is the research director of the CUNY Urban Food Policy Institute. His research explores the policies, governance systems, practices, and infrastructure to support socially just, healthy, ecologically resilient, and economically viable urban and regional food systems. Dr. Cohen is the co-author of Beyond Kale, Urban Agriculture and Social Justice Activism in New York City, that examines the potential of urban farms and gardens to address racial, gender, and class oppression. Dr. Cohen has a PhD in urban planning and policy development from Rutgers University, a master's in city and regional planning from Berkeley, and a BA from Cornell. During our time today with Nevin, we will be hearing a presentation on a project that he's working on, that is the creation of a prototype food environment equity dashboard for New York City, or FEED-NYC. And I'm going to pass to Nevin in a moment. However, so following the presentation, we'll have plenty of time for questions, discussion, but please do feel free to put whatever questions you have in the chat as they come up, just so you don't forget them, but know that there will be time at the end to ask questions. And so without further ado, I'm going to pass to Nevin. And Nevin, if you need to share your screen, you should be able to do so.
Terrific. Well, thank you so much for inviting me today. And it's really good to see so many familiar faces and some new faces. Give me just a second while I find the place to share. Terrific. So can you see the proper PowerPoint now? Great. Thanks. Well, thanks for inviting me. I'm going to talk today about a project that we started in the fall that is funded by the National Science Foundation. It's very exciting. And before I get into that project, I want to talk a little bit about metrics and indicators and why they're important. Give you some examples of the evolution of food metrics over time, and then talk about the project. And then I hope we have most of the time for discussion, including especially about metrics and indicators that people in the group might feel are valuable for the Hudson Valley. So let's begin. The first thing I want to talk about is why focus on metrics and how does data influence policy? And I'm going to use the term metrics for the most part. Metrics are a specific type of data selected to illustrate a particular concept. Indicators are made up of metrics, but they are designed to show trends and changes or otherwise contextualize metrics. So there are differences, but I'm going to use the term metrics just for simplicity. The first point I want to make is that metrics are always socially constructed. Right? They present particular worldviews that might be or are usually limited or distorted. People construct metrics based on what they feel is important to measure and focus on. Often resource availability. Organizations and agencies have limited resources, so they tend to use the metrics that they can readily collect. They're based on methodological conventions. They often reflect the interests of those choosing the metrics, the political interests. They may desire to include or exclude certain groups from decision-making. And they can shape and even foreclose options. And yet, while metrics are chosen by human beings for very specific purposes, people often perceive, because they're often displayed as numbers, that data is value neutral. And because metrics are often seen as value neutral by many people, they especially confer power on those who create and convey them. And these are, I think, important ideas to keep in mind as we think about developing metrics. Just to give you two examples. On the left is an illustration from a book that I really love. It was written by Walter Hedden in 1929 for the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, and it was called How Great Cities Are Fed. There was a rail strike underway, and Walter Hedden mapped where food shipments were coming from that fed New York City to make the point, the political point, that the rail strike could dismantle food access for New York City, and that thinking about, and he coined the term food shed, thinking about the food shed was really important if we wanted to make sure that we had food security. And this map is showing the car lot shipments of iceberg lettuce in the West and bib lettuce on the East Coast that are marketed throughout the country, illustrating that knowing where the food is coming from is really critical to understanding whether it can be accessible across the country. The indicator on the right is one of the many indicators chosen by the Milan Urban Food Policy Pact for monitoring city adherence to the pact. And indicator 8 is the number of households living in food deserts. And that's a very controversial concept, because they measure, in this indicator, measure food deserts as the geospatial distribution of food retail and socioeconomic population groups to understand the number or percentage of households living a certain distance from food markets. So getting back to the points I made just in the previous slide, that focuses attention on food retail and physical food access, as opposed to economic access to food. And so, again, it's just an illustration of how indicators really determine the focus and include specific groups in helping to frame how a problem is conceptualized. For example, and just to, not to belabor the point, but if we focus on food deserts and use that concept and focus on retail, that suggests that the solution to this big problem is more retail. And I will argue that upstream social determinants of food access are far more important, like economic sustainability and income and poverty levels. How do metrics influence food systems? They do it in a number of ways. They measure the condition of a food system. They represent specific food system characteristics and call out certain characteristics like geospatial distribution, for example, or quality or ecological impacts. They, in doing so, focus attention on certain aspects of a food system, whether it's equity, resilience, efficiency. They can help with evaluation and assessment of interventions, really understanding what difference it makes if we subsidize and put a new supermarket in a particular neighborhood, or build community gardens throughout a city. And pardon my dog in the back. The only creature more obsessed with food is my dog Jake. I apologize for that. They facilitate communication among stakeholders. So indicators can stimulate a real dialogue about what matters most and what's less important, what's more important. And finally, they, in doing so, raise salience of certain issues, influence perception, and therefore shape solutions. And they play specific types of roles in policymaking. Obviously, there's the instrumental role. They provide data to help decision makers problem solve. What percentage of people in our city are food insecure, and therefore, how can we create an intervention that solves that problem? And how do we measure whether food insecurity is decreasing over time? But they also motivate stakeholders to take action by helping them understand problems and potential policies and outcomes. Metrics are often used tactically. An indicator that shows that things are improving can be used to delay action, while another indicator to show that problems are getting much, much worse are meant to accelerate action. Metrics are symbols of conditions and signify consequences that may only partly reflect reality, but be important because they're symbolic. And finally, metrics can help advocates build political support for their positions. I teach a course in public health advocacy, and one of the things that students have to do is develop a metric, sometimes an infographic, to show to a lawmaker, because for all the reasons I've discussed before, metrics can draw attention to a problem and make it salient for a decision maker. So metrics have evolved over time, especially in the food sector. I want to explain how we've gone from simple PDFs to sophisticated technologies, and sometimes we still use PDFs. So one example is the New York City Food Metrics Report, which comes out in PDF form. I hope this is the last year that it's in PDF, because I think it's a static form that is easy to read, but not very useful otherwise. So metrics are often static government curated outputs of information. And the Food Metrics Report acknowledges upfront that it's really a report of program outputs and not outcomes, which is an important distinction. So one metric in the report is about the program FRESH, which is a financial and zoning incentive program to have supermarkets built in neighborhoods deemed to be underserved by food retail. So between 2009 and 2021, 43 zoning and incentive projects were approved, 34 were completed and are open to the public. They equal over 1 million square feet of new or renovated grocery store space in New York. And they employ 1,700 employees, all important metrics, but all metrics that focus attention on very specific aspects of this one area of food access. If we begin to think about ways to display that information differently and contextualize that information, we can come up with very different conclusions. So I created this map of the fresh grocers in the Melrose neighborhood. I'm sorry, these are all the grocers in the Melrose neighborhood of the Bronx. Food Bazaar received fresh incentives. So those are new or expanded grocers in this neighborhood. But if you map the area that constitutes a 5-minute walk and a 7-minute walk around the different grocers in this neighborhood, you see that those shapes are all overlapping, because in fact, there are a lot of grocers in this neighborhood that has been deemed through another process of generating metrics as being underserved by food retailers. And so it raises the question of whether the FRESH program is incentivizing grocers in the wrong places, or whether this neighborhood really deserves an increased percentage or concentration of grocers for other reasons besides sheer proximity to where people are living. It raises questions about whether the people who live in this neighborhood find these grocers to be suitable and good values and affordable. It raises all sorts of questions that the FRESH program really isn't designed to answer. If you use a technology like Google Street View, as my colleagues and I did, to look at grocers in the Bronx between 2008 and 2017, we actually looked at photographs of every food retailer in the Bronx. We saw a different perspective on supermarkets. These two photographs happen to be in Brooklyn. The top right is a fresh grocer that's received a zoning incentive and is going to be built. And it's going to be built across the street from Fresh Valley, which is a supermarket that opened after the development on the right was approved for zoning incentives. Right, so there's going to be a fresh market across from another big supermarket that just opened. And around the corner is the photograph below of a fine fare supermarket. And so it raises the question in my mind of how this program is operating and whether it's actually adding value in terms of food access to neighborhoods. And then you can take a look at the supermarkets that exist throughout the city. And this is an overlay that shows the percentage of supermarkets in New York City on so-called soft sites. That's a planning term that means a site is occupied by a building that is less dense than the allowable zoning on that site. And so a soft site is important because it's potentially more valuable for more dense development. And so these images are the percentage by neighborhood of supermarkets on soft sites where those supermarkets are particularly vulnerable to development. And so this tells a completely different story about which neighborhoods are particularly vulnerable to having their supermarkets develop into other kinds of uses. And those are clustered in northern Manhattan and the central Bronx and parts of Brooklyn and Queens. You can look at another set of data, and these are all important, and it illustrates another important point, which is that it's important to tell a full story by including a variety of types of metrics. This is the City Planning Department's built environment maps of different neighborhoods. This is the Hunts Point neighborhood of the South Bronx, where the Hunts Point produce market is located, and a neighborhood in which policymakers are really concerned that there is not enough access to supermarkets. And this illustrates one of the central problems as to why there aren't more supermarkets in the neighborhood is it's zoning. So the dark pink area is zoned for industrial and manufacturing, and there would have to be, if those are unoccupied sites at all, there would have to be a zoning change or a variance to allow a supermarket on those sites. So there's just not a lot of available land for supermarkets to come in and inexpensively build a supermarket. That's just one reason why there aren't more supermarkets in this neighborhood, but it can stimulate a discussion about what has to change in a community in order for there to be more food access and more fresh fruits and vegetables in that community. Another way to look at this same question is using data that I'm using with some colleagues now to look at how people move around the city to shop for food. It's using data from a company called Safegraph, which buys mobile app location data from a whole range of mobile app companies, and then aggregates the data, de-identifies it, and then reproduces it for companies that want to know where to locate a new store, for example. But they allow this data to be used for free to researchers. So what we did was we looked at all of the food retailers in the Bronx. We then looked at the Stop and Shop supermarket. On the upper left corner of the screen, you can see that dot. And then using Safegraph data, we mapped the unique visits from home census block groups to that Stop and Shop supermarket over a period of a month. And what we see is the Stop and Shop, which is sort of in the center of this map. I'm sorry, I can't use a pointer on the screen, is visited by people who live in lots of different neighborhoods surrounding, actually throughout the Bronx. And then you can begin to map the supermarkets that are skipped over by people as they go from their home to this particular Stop and Shop. That raises a number of interesting questions about food access in the Bronx. It raises questions about why people see Stop and Shop as a good value to go to and to travel beyond their neighborhood supermarkets to shop in. And it begins to sort of raise policy questions about whether the city should be incentivizing certain types of supermarkets or certain types of retailers, or whether it's in fact price and value and promotions, and maybe the the size and configuration of stores that make a difference in terms of where people choose to buy their food. Without going into details, I want this to illustrate that there are numerous ways to explore a very specific, detailed question like food access and food acquisition practices. So what are some principles I've learned about good food metrics? It's important to include denominators and not just show, for example, the number of home delivered meals for seniors in New York City, but to show that number over the population of seniors in New York City. That's one of my pet peeves. The New York City Mayor's Management Report shows that home delivered meals for seniors has gone up over the last several years. But what it doesn't show is that the population of seniors in New York City has gone up even faster than the number of, and so the question is, is home delivered meals for seniors inadequate? And what will happen in the future if you project the senior population in New York? It's growing rather rapidly. And so, where is the funding and the political support for programs to support older adults in New York City? It's important to include operational data about programs and causal data to understand why metrics are going up or down or changing in other directions. It's important to combine data from different agencies to tell a full story. It's important, I think, to focus on the upstream determinants of food insecurity and other factors. So looking at, and that's related to combining data from different agencies, looking at questions like housing affordability in thinking about putting together a food metrics report or dashboard. It's important to use platforms that enable live updates because this data changes very rapidly, and to incorporate both big and small data, program reports, as well as data captured through new technologies like either Google Street View or mobile app location data. And finally, it's important, I think, to facilitate interactive exploration of this data by communities. And that means, that could mean crowdsourcing the raw data from communities, and it can mean also allowing communities and other stakeholders to manipulate the data in real time to answer different questions that they may have, or to show how the data tell different stories depending on how the data are combined or recombined. Okay, so this is and tell me if I'm running out of time. The Food Environment Equity Dashboard was a project funded through the Smart and Connected Communities program of NSF. And Smart and Connected Communities aims to understand how technology can change the way cities, broadly defined, operate. The goals for our project, and we were funded with a one-year seed grant, a small one-year seed grant, with the aim of enabling our team to develop and submit a full proposal to NSF for multi-year funding. But our main goal is to co-design, create, and evaluate a prototype data dashboard for New York City. And then we are preparing and evaluating 3 use cases for that data to illustrate how the dashboard prototype can draw attention to and frame problems, influence perceptions of them, and shape efforts to solve them by 3 different types of stakeholders: advocates, service providers like emergency food providers, and government officials like the Mayor's Office of Food Policy in New York City. This is an illustration of the project team. It includes a range of academics from different disciplines, including computer science, urban planning, myself, and public health, and CBOs like Community Food Advocates, Hunger Free America, Grow-NYC, West Side Campaign Against Hunger, and New York City government officials, both on the administration side and on the city council side. Some research questions that we're focused on are: how can we use innovative technologies to illustrate and explain disparities in food security? And I should clarify that This is a food environment equity dashboard, but we've decided for this year to focus on illustrating food security questions that are most salient to the team. Our second research question is to what extent can we use novel analytical methods? One of our team members is an expert in agent-based modeling, sort of understanding how representations of humans in a particular community, a geographic area, make decisions, and using existing data on how people make decisions, for example, about where they shop, to then model different scenarios in the future. Can we use agent-based modeling? Can we use embedded sensors and other forms of big data, imagery, to enable stakeholders to visualize, communicate, and model alternate scenarios to reduce food insecurity? And how does the process of dashboard development, deciding on what are the most salient questions to answer, picking the metrics to use, figuring out how to manipulate them and illustrate them to tell a story, advanced evidence and equity-based policymaking in New York City? How does that process empower advocates to act? How does it help service providers both be more efficient, but also maybe lobby for more resources? How does it enable government to make decisions? I won't get into this. This is just the project timeline. We started in November. We're ending in the fall of 2022. We through a series of workshops and interviews, we came up with really 3 areas of focus for the dashboard. The first is, and these were in the form of questions: how can we optimize the use of government food programs by eligible households? So how do we ensure that people who are eligible for SNAP are signing up for SNAP? A second overall objective is, how can policies improve emergency food systems services? How can we ensure that, in a crisis like COVID, people are not going hungry? And third, how can we improve access to affordable, healthy food? The second row in this diagram are the specific indicators we're hoping to visualize. So in terms of optimizing the use of government food programs, we're looking at the number of SNAP eligible but unenrolled individuals by neighborhood, an indicator that doesn't yet exist. We have data in New York City on SNAP participation by community district, but we don't have a similar level of data on eligibility. That's something that we're going to have to estimate in this dashboard. A second indicator is the unmet need of school food. So we know that school food is, probably the majority of calories that many students in the school system are eating per day. And a key question, and now that school lunches are universal in New York City, key question is, are there neighborhoods where food insecurity levels are really high and participation in the school food program is lower than we would expect? And what's accounting for that if we find those neighborhoods? And how can school food participation be increased in those neighborhoods? To understand how policies can improve emergency food system services, we're looking at measuring the mismatched availability and need of emergency food. That's really complicated, recognizing that people travel outside their neighborhood to get to food pantries. And food pantries often, especially the very small ones, have a really hard time keeping track of and doing the paperwork to track how much they're distributing of the food that they have and who they're distributing it to. So figuring out how to measure that metric, whether there's a mismatch need and where those neighborhoods are, where the need is higher than the availability is really critical. And a second indicator is the metric of emergency food quality or perceived quality compared to need. We know that during the pandemic, the city distributed lots of food around the city. Some of it was really high quality. We have evidence that other emergency food distribution programs were distributing random assortments of highly processed food that people didn't really think was appropriate or healthy. For our third objective, how can we improve access to affordable, healthy food? We're trying to illustrate an important aspect of food access, which is cost. And so in a city like New York, neighborhoods vary significantly in the cost of food. And so we're trying to, and certainly they vary in terms of housing costs. Even for people in New York City Housing Authority developments who pay only a small fixed portion of their income to the city in rent, having high-priced food in the surrounding neighborhood means that people have to travel far distances to get affordable food. And that's a cost, that's a significant cost in time and transportation dollars. A second indicator we want to illustrate is what we're calling shopping burdened neighborhood. So we're not using simplistic distance as a measure of food access, but we're trying to come up with a more sophisticated indicator of shopping burdened neighborhoods where it's difficult to get affordable food. So that includes affordability and proximity and something to do with how people perceive the quality and value of the stores in their neighborhood. And I won't go into this in detail because I want to leave time for discussion, but the third layer in this diagram are the specific metrics we're going to use to try to develop those indicators. And the light blue row are the ways in which we're trying to combine those metrics to identify the specific gaps and answer those questions. So we're looking at identifying, for example, neighborhoods with high food insecurity rates, low SNAP caseloads, and, for example, high citizen status, recognizing that neighborhoods with low citizenship status populations are likely to be under-enrolled, even though needy of SNAP because of fear of using a government benefit. Looking at the middle column, we're looking at identifying neighborhoods with high food insecurity rates and low numbers of food pantries, and also some measure of neighborhoods where people aren't using the closest available food pantries to understand if they aren't, why aren't they? Why are they traveling from, in some cases, as we know anecdotally, the Bronx to the west side of Manhattan to go to a food pantry, skipping over food pantries in their neighborhood. And in the third column, for example, we're looking at neighborhoods with high food prices, high rent burdens, and incomes that are above SNAP eligibility to understand which neighborhoods have vulnerable populations that probably qualify for public benefits, yet are also burdened by high food prices in their community. Let me show you, and the bottom row is our estimation of how these indicators can be used to influence policy. So if we find neighborhoods that are food insecure, where school children are underutilizing school food, that can help us focus attention on efforts to increase participation rates at selected schools or in specific school districts. And we can also begin to examine the school offerings, both the food as well as the cafeteria setup, the hours in which school lunch is served throughout the day, and other variables that might account for variation in the use of school food. And I won't go into these in detail, but we've diagrammed out these models. So the top blue box is our indicator of SNAP eligible but unenrolled communities over neighborhood need. So the food insecure neighborhoods where there's a high degree of eligible but unenrolled people in SNAP. We're trying to, the green shapes are the metrics that we have to develop that don't yet exist, but will be developed by combining other metrics or using innovative technologies. So to estimate SNAP eligibility, we're going to look at the populations by neighborhood that are below 200% of the poverty level and therefore likely to qualify for SNAP, and the percent of SNAP participation to develop a metric of eligible but unenrolled, and to understand some of the factors that might be causing a large percentage of the population in a neighborhood to be eligible but not enrolled. We're going to look at demographic metrics like the percent foreign born in the neighborhood, the percent living in temporary housing in that community, the percent of college students, all populations that are likely for a variety of reasons to not enroll in SNAP even if they qualify. To understand the neighborhoods where school food participation is lower than we would expect given food insecurity levels in that neighborhood, we're going to look at food insecurity by using Feeding America's neighborhood meal gap and school food participation data by district, which we can get from the Department of Education. But to understand why school cafeterias may be underutilized, we're going to look at individual school cafeteria conditions. The Department of Health in New York City rates the school cafeteria based on sanitary conditions, just like restaurants. And I mentioned before, this New York City Council requires the Department of Education to publish the hours in which school lunch is served. And in some schools, as many of you know, school lunch can start at 10 a.m. and go until 3 p.m., probably accounting for students not going to the cafeteria for lunch because they've already eaten or it's too early for them to eat lunch. And we're looking at, and the circular green icons are the data we're going to collect using new methods. So we're investigating crowdsourcing techniques to get us to understand from the student's perspective their perception of the cafeteria food quality and conditions. To understand neighborhood emergency food adequacy, we're actually looking at using crowdsourced data from the organization Plentiful on responses to queries that they send out to emergency food pantry clients, asking them about the quality and availability of food, and using Safegraph location data to understand how people are moving about the city to access food in emergency food pantries. To understand at the neighborhood scale, which neighborhoods are what we're calling healthy food unaffordable neighborhoods, where people have to go somewhere else to buy affordable food. We're looking at using two techniques to get healthy food prices by neighborhood. One is scraping supermarket circulars from the web or other sources of price data from the web, and using crowdsourced techniques like Google sentiment reviews. You would be surprised, I was surprised at how many people take the time to post a Google review of their local supermarket. And in those reviews, people use terms like, there's a large assortment of food, it's expensive, it's a good value, and you can use techniques to disentangle the words that people use into sentiments that people are expressing about those supermarkets, and get a different understanding of why people may be shopping in certain markets and not others. In terms of the cost of living, which is highly variable. We're going to be looking at existing data on rent burdens and things like energy burdens that people face in different neighborhoods. So I'll end there. I've given you a lot of information. I know I just posted these as possible discussion questions, but I'm really open to anything you want to talk about. What are some of the critical questions or issues you would like to see a food systems dashboard in the Hudson Valley help to answer or visualize, or in a specific community in the Hudson Valley? What do you see as the biggest data information gaps that, if we could close them, would help with decision-making to advance food justice? And what publicly available or private data sources should be visualized for the public to see? Those are just some questions I thought might start us off, but I will stop there.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that, Nevin. That was a lot of information, however, very interesting. And, you know, I was interested to hear about how those gaps in data, you know, could be mapped and analyzed, and, you know, just demonstrating how innovation and, you know, how we can use different technologies to do just that. And the team that you have compiled on this project just seems incredible. And I do like that you're taking the approach by engaging advocates, service providers, and local government as well, because I think that, you know, it's very smart. So those are
I
great.
just want to clarify that the team is the team we put in the NSF proposal, but this process is open to whoever is really interested and wants to participate. So we've made it clear that the workshops are open to people who'd like to attend them and participate. And we're hoping to get feedback through the team members of a larger number of stakeholders that they're affiliated with on this project. So yeah.
Great. And that information, if folks are interested, is that posted to the CUNY website, or can you share that info with us all so people know how to plug in?
Yeah, we don't have a website yet for FEED-NYC, but I'm happy to share my contact information and be in touch when we do have something that's more accessible up on the web.
Great. And so I want to offer space for folks that have questions, and then we can dig into those discussion questions that you posed. So if folks who have questions, I see Angela just raised a hand. So we can start off with you. And then if you feel more comfortable putting your questions into the chat, that's an option as well. But Angela, why don't you go ahead and get us started?
Thanks, Sarah. And thanks, Nevin, for your time. This was extremely rich. I really enjoyed your framings of metrics and indicators and the difference there. I have two questions for you. And one is really about this concept of a food systems dashboard and how, as place-based practitioners, we should think about it. So we're operating in the Hudson Valley. Some of us work in larger scale. This dashboard looks at New York City. And I saw on your team, Jess Fanzo, who I've worked with, to think about global dashboards. How do these dashboards roll up or roll down or scale in to support decision makers and practitioners in a place-based way? How applicable are they in moving up and down that scale is my first question. Mm-hmm. And then my second question is a question about the word dashboard. Because the word itself, like, I think about a dashboard as like, you know, it tells me how my car is running. And my car is complicated, but it's not complex. And food systems are complex. And what we need to be listening to when we listen to food systems are some of those emergent messages. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering how you're capturing the emergence of kind of the complex adaptive nature of food systems in the dashboard concept. So those are my two questions.
So on the question of scale, that's an important one. Jessica Fanzo has a dashboard project that is at the national scale. It's meant to answer different questions, right? It's meant to answer questions about, you know, food production nationally for agricultural ministries to make decisions about, you know, investments, and the scales are not fungible. I think, in my perspective, they're very different questions that are important to answer at different scales, because different jurisdictions are governed in different ways. And so, I mean, I think it might be important in a city dashboard to have some data on the food system writ large, or maybe food prices, which might be national in scale. But really the actionable data points are going to be bounded geographically in some fashion, right? So we can know like what national inflation rates are for food, but the real question for decision makers at the municipal scale will be, what are food prices in different neighborhoods related to income levels, and what does that mean for policies around income support or a rent eviction moratorium policy. In terms of the car dashboard is the interesting one, right? Because what happens when the engine light comes on, right? You know that something's wrong with the engine, but you don't know anything more about that. So dashboards are by their nature reductive. What I'm suggesting is that they don't have to be as reductive as they conventionally are, that they can actually answer really interesting questions, but that changes the nature of a dashboard, which is originally designed to oversimplify a set of concepts, so that when you're driving at 80 miles down the highway, you just have to look at one number, the speed or the. I guess this project is to maybe make more complex a food systems dashboard, and to show how complex food systems really are. And one of my pet peeves is that we bound the food system around food too much, and we don't include metrics around rent and energy costs and immigration status and other really important metrics. I hope that answers your question, but for the back and forth.
Great, thank you. And I see Cohen, you have a hand.
Yeah, thank you, Nevin. At the top, you sort of had in one of the charts, which I think we're all aware of, that the questions you ask to gather these metrics reflect more of those who are asking the questions. And I think that the step further of that is then the results you gather. Sorry, it's a child in the background. The results you gather reflect a certain, and actually create a reality. That's why I like predictive models keep repeating the same futures, because they're based on the past that replicate a future. So I'm sort of wondering, are there ways that you imagine, bringing in impacted folks who are impacted by food insecurity into the development of questions framed in a way that's sort of a visioning, dreaming, imagining what is the world and life they want. So therefore, potentially the models you create and the results you generate reflect a dream vision, rather than just, what is understood as like, neutral data, or just what is currently happening. Like is a way to change that, to reframe the way the questions are asked to. And then also, to that point of like the food being siloed, and that not taking into account housing and health and employment. And are there ways that you also imagine the dashboard projects and all that, data being used to gather, to then sort of, overlap, like various Vesica Pisces of ways that these other overlapping oppressive systems, is that a future step?
Yes. So to answer your first question, I agree that sort of the lived experiences are critical to sort of framing the questions that the dashboard is supposed to try to answer. We're doing that one step removed by inviting groups that work with individual clients and advocacy organizations like community food advocates who work with coalitions of advocacy groups, but we haven't taken the step of inviting creating focus groups to directly solicit information from individuals. I have to say that in my experience, this needs to be an iterative process, because even if you conduct a really well-run focus group, people have preconceived notions from their own reading of information and the information that they see around them about the possibilities, and those possibilities get bounded really narrowly. So if you go into a neighborhood and you say, what can we do to improve the food system? Often the first thought is we need a new supermarket in our neighborhood. And getting beyond that to think about, well, what about the cost of food? What about equalizing income, making housing really affordable in our community? One of the goals of the dashboard is to begin to, I guess, deconstruct how we can think about problems so that those other concepts can be sort of included in the discussion. So that we can imagine, say, I don't know, publicly owned food retailer in our neighborhood that might be a possibility to improve food access, or changing the nature of the SNAP program so that it is more easily available to a wider range of people, and even problematizing SNAP as a solution to low income, which is the fundamental reason people can't afford to feed their families. So I don't know if that, I guess I envision this process as being iterative and not ending with the actual creation of something that we then show to communities and say, this represents your food system, but we rather use it as a pedagogical tool to then ask what's not represented in these metrics, or is there an even different way of thinking about the problem of food insecurity or malnourishment or obesity that we can represent with this information.
Great. Excellent. Thank you for that. Are there any other questions from folks?
I don't know what my question is exactly, but I guess more of a comment. And it's just from my years of working in SNAP Ed and other government programs. And so I really like the way you're talking about looking at problems, not problems, but issues in a different way or through a different framework, because so much of the work, at least with SNAP Ed, was just like very output focused. And the reason was because that's what the funders say we need to do. So it would be really nice to use some kind of information or tool like this to not only inform work that's happening on the ground, but inform how the funders then are defining what that work is. So yeah, I don't know. That's not a question. I just was thinking out loud.
That's a really great point, Katie, because a lot of the way that we generate data is based on, what we're required to report as organizations, and, what the funders are looking to fund based on those reports. And it does create this kind of gnarly cycle where we're not actually gathering what the need is, or, as Cohen express what the community might like to see or where they see their future in the food system. It's a very good point.
Often it's just expedient because we know that we can easily collect information on the participants in SNAP Ed, for example, but we can't really, we don't have the resources to really understand what it is people want to know to begin with, or how new knowledge affects their behavior more generally.
Megan, I saw your hand, and Angela, I see your request in the chat.
Yeah, I do have a question, and I hope it's not too broad, but Nevin, I so appreciate this work generally and the time you're taking to present it to us. And I was really hearing the framing you were giving at the start, saying, it's the upstream solutions that often need attention. So I'm wondering how you think about the articulation of the dashboard and the data that is very much a snapshot, and you were saying it's sort of a pedagogical tool to say this is what the food system looks like, and working with policymakers, or as Katie was saying, with funders who are sort of looking for this output. How do you see it relating to education about how we got to this snapshot moment, how some of those root causes weren't just that there wasn't a grocery store, but why wasn't there a grocery store, and maybe the policies or the political factors that played into it? I mean, I think it's maybe a lot to put onto one tool, but if there are other tools you imagine is needed to fill that out, or if you see the utility of that, I just was sort of curious as to your thoughts about that piece of education, the historic underpinning of how we got here. Yeah.
No, I think that would be really useful. It's sort of not in our scope at this point, but I've seen, for example, a great exhibit of red line maps, right, which help explain, poverty, housing patterns, retail patterns as well. So, I think it's possible to create a dashboard that is both historical and can be used to explain current and then projected future scenarios.
That's really interesting. And I know there was an interesting report recently on, Nevin, I think you posted this on LinkedIn, on gentrification and how that impacts food retail. And I think that might be a cool overlay too, based on historic, red line maps and how underserved, valued and disinvested communities exist now, and what the potential for overdevelopment and, how to price out neighborhoods could be. And then Angela, I'm looking at you for your quick question, but it doesn't have to be
super quick, but it's actually on vein here. So we're talking about, physical space redlining, fruit apartheid came into the chat. I saw a report coming out of Cape Town's Western Cape centering informal food vendors as a really central part of their story in food access. I know New York City is not Cape Town, but how does informality and informal food vendors, informal fruit and veg sellers, how do they fit into your dashboard, and did they come out as important in your analysis?
They are not in this limited prototype dashboard, but you raise a really important point, and the key question is how to collect information about this sector. It's informal, and it means it's hard to measure. But I think that I would be really interested in, and we have a project proposal underway to do a lot of research on app-based food delivery workers in New York City. But I think it's really critical to begin to use more sophisticated tools, but they can be simple, like text-based queries, to really find out information about people who are in the informal sector. The issue in Cape Town is this common around the developing world, the supermarketization of developing countries, where planners, envision, because their metrics are food safety, cold chain compliance. They see supermarkets as being far superior to conventional food vendors, and push them out. But one part of the project is to really understand what new technologies can be used to unearth information that has traditionally been just excluded from databases because it's hard to collect. So crowdsourcing, tracking apps, even if we don't, it's de-identified information, we have to worry about personal identity security. But can we also use other sort of low-tech techniques, in-person interviews, to really find out why informal vendors choose to locate where they are, what their market is, if they're serving particular portions of the population, or and what threats they face from development.
Jordan.
Yeah, thank you for this. This is really inspiring. And part of the inspiration feels like the sort of the education you've been doing around through this presentation about all the variables that are going into these metrics and also the considerations around which variables we're missing. And I'm wondering if the plan is for that kind of breakdown to be part of the dashboard interface itself, like when it becomes a tool, is that kind of process going to be part of what visitors to that site interact with?
So all we can do in the first year, and this is a 1-year project, is to create user cases. So actually think through what a scenario, how a city official might use this information, what they might do with it, how an advocate might use it. And then we're going to survey people about those scenarios. Do these scenarios seem realistic? Have we missed something, some way that you might use this information? So that's what we're going to analyze in the first year. And then hopefully if we're funded for a multi-year project, we can actually use some design thinking techniques to help people explore how to use the dashboard in their work, and then maybe track them over time to see whether their use of the dashboard helps them or is it inhibits their advocacy.
Thank you for that. That's a good question. I mean, I see this as being incredibly useful if we get beyond, that first year of funding and are able to take it out into the field and it moves upstream. Any other questions for Nevin? Great. I mean, this has been a really great presentation, a lot of information. I don't think the discussion stops here. Nevin, I don't know if you want to leave us with a few parting words or ways that we can support the project or what to look out for.
Well, I think it would be interesting to sort of think through what metrics are really relevant for the Hudson Valley as a whole. Issues of land price increases, farmland insecurity, levels of poverty within affluent communities throughout the Hudson Valley, and what that looks like. I mean, one issue that we've explored in Eastern Long Island is the invisibility of low-income, working class people, often working in the food system, who don't have affordable housing and transportation that they can afford. So what are some metrics that would be really interesting to illustrate? And maybe this group as a whole or some members of this group could be part of the sort of project feed project 2.0. But I really appreciate your questions and really thoughtful questions, provocative questions, and I look forward to continuing the discussion.
Absolutely. I mean, I know, so for the food access group, we've been working on creating a series of surveys to try and map what barriers exist to getting healthy food into Hudson Valley communities, just to get a baseline so that we can build, the advocacy and the lobbying power to go to our, state level and other local level politicians and say, hey, this is what we need across the region. So I'm seeing, our discussion have already kind of unveiled a number of different kinds of metrics that we're looking for, or we'd like to have kind of like a baseline analysis of. So, I mean, we'll definitely be continuing, if everyone in the food access group is into it, this discussion as we meet moving forward. And we do tend to meet on a monthly basis. So Nevin, you're always welcome to join. We're doing it on Zoom, so it's easy to jump onto those meetings, and they're all posted on the Hudson Valley Food Systems Coalition website. But
yeah, I'm happy to give informal or more formal feedback if you'd like.
Absolutely.
An independent.
Actually, I think Maggie Dickinson said she was going to reach out to you because I was talking with her recently on our survey. So I think you're already being pulled in.
I think Maggie's living in the Hudson Valley now.
In Beacon, yep.
Great.
Great. So this has been incredible, very exciting work. Thank you so, so much again. And the conversation will continue. I want to thank everyone for joining today. I know it's Friday afternoon and the questions were incredible. And I hope that you have a great weekend. It's 50 degrees outside here. So enjoy the sunshine.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.